The story of the Irish slave trade is a harrowing journey through the depths of human cruelty. It is a tale often overshadowed by the larger narrative of the transatlantic slave trade, yet it stands as a chilling testament to the brutality of colonialism and religious persecution. The seeds of this dark chapter were sown in the aftermath of the Battle of Kinsale in 1601. The defeat of the Irish and their Spanish allies marked a turning point in Irish history, solidifying English control over the island and ushering in an era of ruthless oppression. Thousands of Irish soldiers, captured in the wake of the battle, became the first victims of this burgeoning trade. Deemed enemies of the crown and heretics by the Protestant English, these prisoners of war were stripped of their rights and shipped across the Atlantic. Their destination, the fledgling colonies of the New World, where they would toil as slaves in the fields of tobacco, sugar, and cotton. The year 1612 witnessed a grim milestone, the first recorded sale of Irish slaves to a settlement on the banks of the Amazon River. This event marked the beginning of a systematic trade in human beings that would see hundreds of thousands of Irish men, women, and children forcibly transported from their homeland. Driven by a toxic mix of economic greed and religious animosity, English merchants and landowners viewed the Irish as a readily available and exploitable source of labour. These early Irish slaves faced unimaginable hardships in the New World. Treated with unspeakable cruelty, they were subjected to back-breaking labour, starvation, and disease. Their lives were considered expendable, their deaths a mere inconvenience to their captors. The Catholic faith of the Irish further served to exacerbate their suffering. Viewed with contempt by the Protestant English, Irish slaves were denied basic human rights and subjected to relentless religious persecution. The early decades of the 17th century saw the Irish slave trade evolve from a trickle to a steady stream of human misery. As English colonialism expanded across the Caribbean and North America, so too did the demand for cheap and disposable labour. The middle of the 17th century witnessed a dramatic escalation in the Irish slave trade, driven by the ruthless policies of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell's invasion of Ireland in 1649 unleashed a wave of terror and brutality that left an indelible scar on the Irish psyche. Driven by a fervent Puritan zeal and a deep-seated hatred for Catholicism, Cromwell sought to crush Irish resistance and establish English Protestant dominance over the island. His methods were nothing short of genocidal. Cromwell's troops laid waste to the Irish countryside, massacring civilians and driving countless families from their homes. The aftermath of Cromwell's conquest saw the systematic dispossession of the Irish Catholic landowning class. Under the infamous Act of Settlement of 1652, vast tracts of land were confiscated from Irish Catholics and granted to English soldiers and adventurers. This act of legalized theft had a devastating impact on Irish society, reducing many to a state of utter destitution. The Irish slave trade flourished in this climate of violence and displacement. Cromwell saw the forced transportation of the Irish as a convenient solution to the Irish problem. Thousands of Irish men, women, and children were rounded up and shipped across the Atlantic, destined for a life of servitude in the colonies. The West Indies, with its insatiable appetite for sugar, became a prime destination for these unfortunate souls. In 1652, Cromwell ordered the transportation of 12,000 Irish prisoners to Barbados, where they were sold into slavery on the island's sugar plantations. This marked a turning point in the Irish slave trade, transforming it from a sporadic practice into a well-organized and highly profitable enterprise. The plight of these Irish slaves was particularly grim. Forced to endure appalling living and working conditions, they were subjected to unimaginable cruelty at the hands of their masters. The question of whether Irish slaves were treated as chattel slaves or indentured servants is a complex and often debated one. While some historians argue that Irish servitude differed from the chattel slavery experienced by Africans, evidence suggests that the reality was far more nuanced and often indistinguishable. Indentured servitude, a system prevalent in the English colonies, involved a contract between a servant and a master. The servant agreed to work for a set period, typically 4 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to the colonies and, upon completion of their term, freedom dues such as land or money. However, In the case of the Irish, these contracts were often little more than a cruel charade. Many Irish men and women were tricked or coerced into signing indentures, only to find themselves trapped in a system that offered little hope of freedom. Furthermore, the legal status of Irish Catholics as enemies of the Crown meant they were often denied the basic protections afforded to other indentured servants. Irish slaves were bought and sold as property, their lives and labour controlled entirely by their masters. They were subjected to brutal punishments, denied access to education, and prohibited from marrying or raising families without their master's consent. The line between indentured servitude and chattel slavery for the Irish was often blurred beyond recognition. The sexual exploitation of Irish women and girls further highlights the horrors they faced. Irish women were often seen as commodities to be bought, sold, and abused by their masters. The practice of breeding Irish women with African slaves, in an attempt to produce lighter-skinned and therefore more desirable slaves, is a particularly abhorrent example of this exploitation. This practice not only underscores the dehumanization of Irish women, but also reveals the complex interplay of race, class, and power within the slave societies of the New World. The Price of Humanity, comparing Irish and African slavery. The Irish and African slave trades, while distinct in their origins and evolution, were undeniably intertwined. Both systems were rooted in the brutal realities of colonialism, driven by economic greed and fueled by racial and religious prejudice. However, there were key differences in the ways these systems operated and the experiences of those enslaved. One significant difference lay in the cost of slaves. Irish slaves were generally cheaper to purchase than their African counterparts. This was due, in part, to their availability. The mass displacement and dispossession of the Irish under Cromwell's regime created a large pool of readily exploitable labour. Furthermore, the prevailing anti-Catholic sentiment among the English Protestant elite meant that Irish slaves were viewed as less than human, their lives valued little more than livestock. This difference in price had profound implications for the treatment of slaves. Some historians argue that African slaves, being a more expensive investment, were treated marginally better than Irish slaves. However, this assertion is highly debatable and often ignores the horrific brutality inflicted upon both groups. The reality is that all slaves, regardless of their origin or cost, were subjected to unimaginable cruelty. The duration of servitude also differed between Irish and African slaves. While African slavery was designed as a permanent and hereditary institution, Irish servitude, at least in theory, offered the possibility of eventual freedom. However, as previously discussed, this freedom was often illusory, with many Irish slaves dying from overwork, disease, or at the hands of their masters, long before they could even hope to taste liberty. The comparison between Irish and African slavery is not intended to diminish the unique suffering endured by Africans. Each group experienced the horrors of slavery in their own way, and their stories deserve to be told and remembered. A legacy of sorrow, the enduring impact of the Irish slave trade. The Irish slave trade, though officially abolished in 1839, cast a long shadow over Irish history and its relationship with the wider world. The trauma of this experience left an indelible mark on the Irish psyche, shaping national identity and fueling resentment towards England for centuries. The legacy of the Irish slave trade is complex and multifaceted. It is a story of exploitation and resilience, of suffering and survival. It is a reminder of the horrors that can be inflicted when greed, prejudice, and indifference are allowed to flourish unchecked. The memory of this dark chapter serves as a stark warning against the dangers of historical amnesia. It's imperative that we acknowledge and learn from the mistakes of the past, lest we repeat them. The Irish slave trade, though often overlooked, is an integral part of the global story of slavery. It is a story that deserves to be told and remembered. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Sláinte.